Hi, what's up everyone? Welcome back. It's your boy Missing Two Tenons, and I would like to introduce you to the granulomatous diseases. There's only two diseases in this category, so shouldn't take too long. And I hope you found the previous video useful if you watched it. If you came directly into this one, hope you find this one helpful too. Let's first discuss and revise what is a granuloma. POD has been such a long time ago, and a lot of us have suppressed PTSD, so we kind of suppress those memories. So a granuloma is a mass or nodule, okay, formed usually against an insoluble antigen or some sort of chronic irritation. So what happens is they activate the mononuclear phagocyte system, and when you come to look at it in biopsy, what you find is this core, this central piece of epithelial histiocytes. Sometimes you also might find some giant cells mixing within that core, just chilling and vibing. But the general idea is you have a core of epithelial histiocytes surrounded by this ring of lymphocytes. And you can see that in the image on the right. So, based on this, what we can say, there are two diseases that fall under the category of granulomatous ILDs. These are basically interstitial lung diseases that present with granulomas. The first one is sarcodiosis. The second one is hypersensitivity pneumonitis. I'm gonna apologize because I may have kind of lied in the previous ending of the fibrotic one when I said, fibrotic was the most important, screw the rest, no one gives a shit. But to be honest, sarcodiosis is kind of important. It's okay, it's important, it's high yield. So that's kind of like a partial lie, so just kind of focus on the sarcodiosis part. And with that, let's dive in. Okay, so sarcodiosis, what is it? It is a condition, it is a disease, where patients have formation of granulomas throughout the body in different tissues. And one of these tissues is the lung, hence why we're talking about this topic today. The cause of sarcodiosis is not completely known. It is thought to be a combination of both a genetic factor and some sort of trigger, some environmental trigger that leads to the formation of these granulomas throughout the body. Epidemiology. Now, this is where things get kind of dicey, I'm going to be honest. This is where shit gets controversial. I'm going to start with a quick disclaimer. I am African, so I have more right than most of you to discuss this, so bear with me. Sarcodiosis is really an African-American disease. It's a partial truth and a lie. Well, let me explain. In questions, in USMLE, in kind of most board questions, sarcodiosis is usually an African American. So usually it's become so prevalent that the meme is, if you see black in the question stem, look for an option for sarcodiosis in the answer. That's just to emphasize, it affects African Americans much more than whites. Also affects the rural areas more than urban cities. I think that point is kind of slightly low yield. Also the age, 40 to 60 year age of onset. So it's not a young person disease, kind of like a middle age disease. Just X-ray and CT findings. Okay, so most important one is a bilateral lymphadenopathy at the hilum. Hard to see in this X-ray, but if you can see at the hilum, the heart shape looks kind of larger than normal. There's nothing wrong with the heart. It's just that the the hilum is enlarged due to the bilateral lymphadenopathy. Also, obviously, in late stages, you will see signs of fibrosis, the classic honeycomb lung, etc. Signs and symptoms of a patient with sarcodiosis, as we said, is a systemic disease, so patients will present with fever, they will present with weight loss, hilar lymphadenopathy, which we can also see in CT, eye and skin lesions, hepatosplenomegaly, etc. When you look at the serum of someone with sarcodiosis, you see two things. Number one, increased levels of ACE, and number two, hypercalcemia due to increased vitamin D levels. There is a fun mnemonic that I created that everyone hates, but if anyone watched One Piece, and I'm not going to spoil it, but bilateral lymphadenopathy, the chest region, and increased ACE levels. Great way to remember sarcodiosis. Treatment plan for sarcodiosis, corticosteroids. Corticosteroids is the treatment of choice. But this is where I really want to tie in something extremely important, not only for sarcodiosis, but all diseases that require corticosteroids in general. The first thing you want to do before you give someone sarcodiosis is you have to rule out TB and other infections. The worst thing you can do and I cannot emphasize this more than once, is if someone has TB and you give him corticosteroids because you thought it was sarcodiosis, you have effectively signed the patient's death sentence. It is a really, really, really bad mistake. Always, for any disease in general, rule out any infections before starting corticosteroids. And if you give a patient corticosteroids, they usually have, I think, 65% recovery with no more symptoms. I think it's 10% with kind of like chronic lung involvement. I'm not completely sure on the stats. I don't think it's particularly high yield. Just know that in general, if you give corticosteroids, you have some good response. Histological findings, there are 3 histological findings in sarcodiosis. Number 1 is obviously the granuloma. If you want to be more specific, a non-caseating granuloma. In case you forgot POD, that basically means that the central core, the epithelial histiocyte core, has no necrosis. So it's a non-caseating granuloma. That's number 1. Number 2 is the presence of asteroid bodies and Schwarman bodies. And here are some pictures of Schwarman bodies. You can see how they look like. Can't really comment. This is the classic appearance of a Schwarman body. And this is an asteroid body. This one looks pretty badass. It's like a star. It looks kind of cute, like a starfish. Obviously, the disease is not cute, but like the histology kind of looks kind of interesting. And by the way, that concludes sarcodiosis. Let's dive right into hypersensitivity pneumonitis. Hypersensitivity pneumonitis, like ILDs, is not a single disease. Rather, it is a spectrum of interstitial lung disorders that are basically all characterized by some sort of hypersensitivity reaction to inhaled organic antigens. Remember, in pneumoconiosis, we had fibrosis due to inhaled mineral dust, right? Chronic inhaled mineral dust. Here we have hypersensitivity, like an immune reaction to organic antigens. When we say organic antigens, we basically mean anything, right? Here is this image on the side, just to kind of emphasize, basically, anything can lead to this hypersensitivity pneumonitis. If you're a farmer and you work with hay or grain or straw, you get farmer's lung. This is the reaction against hay. If you're a pigeon breeder or you have pets, maybe you might get maybe allergic to the droppings of birds, and that's bird fanciers lung. If you have cheese workers lung, if you have a reaction to molded cheese. So again, the names are kind of freaking like insane. And for the first time in my life, pathologists finally named a disease properly. But the point is, it's not a single disease, it's a spectrum. So you might tell me, okay, bro, what's the difference between asthma and hypersensitivity? They're both allergic reaction. They both involve the lungs. Really, the main thing is that asthma heavily affects the bronchi, whilst in hypersensitivity pneumonitis, it has more of an effect in the alveoli. So alveolitis kind of level. In terms of the histological findings, as we said, it falls under the granulomatous class. So it has to have some sort of granuloma. And they do. They have something called a loose granuloma. The granulomas of sarcodiosis are classic. A tight core of epithelial histiocytes, a ring of lymphocytes. You have your asteroid bodies, you have your Schwarman bodies. It's classic. Here, the granulomas are there, but they're kind of loose, they're mobile, they're chilling, kind of like a server aesthetic. You also have lymphocyte infiltration in the interstitium. Again, this is a hypersensitivity reaction. I am expecting some sort of immune cells within the alveoli. This is what I expect, and this is what I find. Signs and symptoms of hypersensitivity pneumonitis acutely is fever, cough, dyspnea, the classic kind of triad. But in chronic patients, then you get your interstitial fibrosis. So if patients continue for a long time, they may develop a kind of irreversible fibrosis. And that's it. That was the end of granulomatous. As you can tell, it's not as bad. And in fact, the next session is even going to be shorter. So I think that's kind of cool, huh? So yeah, peace out, boys. Enjoy.